Antiquity. Atheism in the classical world of ancient history. The Epicurean Philodemus, around 110 to 35 BCE, classified the various kinds of atheists in antiquity as follows: those who say that it is unknown whether there are any gods or what they are like, those who say openly that the gods do not exist, those who clearly imply it. Although this classification is a fairly acceptable one, it stays at the level of ideas and neglects practicing atheists. Of course, more seriously, it does not mention atheism as a labeling device to slander your opponents, be they religious or philosophical. That is why we do not follow Philodemus, but divide our evidence into three periods: the classical period, the Hellenistic period, which started to label earlier thinkers as atheists and developed a soft form of atheism that tried to save the existence of the gods, and of course, the Roman period, when the Christians were called atheoi by the pagans and vice versa. Given its interest for the history of atheism, we will concentrate on the classical period. In all cases, we will use the term atheism rather loosely for those thinkers and people who denied the existence of the gods or put forward theories to explain the existence of the gods. And so the classical period in Greece, obviously they're speaking Greek. We have Protagoras from around 490 to 440 BCE. That would be the 5th century BCE. From Abdera, a city in the northeast of Greece, where Democritus, from around the same time, could have developed into an atheist, but apparently did not. Of course, Protagoras was born, and of course, he was famous for what probably was the opening sentence of his work called Concerning the Gods. As in antiquity, the titles of prose works often consisted of the opening words, "Concerning the gods, I am unable to discover whether they exist or not, or what they are like in form, for there are many hindrances to knowledge, the obscurity of the subject, and the brevity of human life." It is clear from this quote that Protagoras was an agnostic rather than an atheist, as Cicero in his De Natura Deorum, and of course Galen in his De Placitis, and of course still recognized. And Pericles, of course the leading Athenian politician in the middle of the 5th century, invited him to write the constitution of the Pan-Hellenic colony in southern Italy, of course, and even Plato noted in his Meno that Protagoras had lived out his life in high repute. Protagoras belonged to the so-called sophistic movement, a loose term that denotes the critical intellectuals, in particular the philosophers of the second half of the 5th century. The sophists were connected to the books by their contemporaries, of course, those whom one might know that Plato argued against. And of course, this points to literacy as an important condition for the development of critical philosophy. It is important for that philosophy becomes visible around 500 BCE, when Pythagoras, from around 560 to 495, was criticized by Xenophanes. He existed from around 570 to 495 in writing, and Heraclitus, of course, around 500 BCE, even reproached him for having plundered many writings. The latter two influential philosophers also fearlessly attacked the anthropomorphic gods of Homer and Hesiod. The authoritative Greek poets, Xenophanes, even proclaimed the one God greatest among gods and humans. In other words, he and his contemporaries tried to introduce new ideas of the divine, rather than abolishing the idea of the divine altogether. Of course, the situation started to change with Anaxagoras, from around 500 to 428 BCE, who was the first philosopher known to have settled in Athens, at the time the center of intellectual life in Greece, probably in the middle of the 450s. According to the 3rd century CE, Diogenes, he said that the sun was a red-hot mass of metal. We may not think this revolutionary, but for the Athenians, the sun was a god, Helios, and Anaxagoras' observation stripped the sun from its divine nature. God damn. Of course, in his Penopti fragment, which must have appeared shortly before 423 BCE, the playwright Cratinus mocked the philosopher Hippon, who was later pictured as impious because he had stated that the sky is a baking cover. In 423 BCE, Aristophanes put on the clouds and mocked the inhabitants of the reflectory for espousing the same idea. Socrates even says, "I walk the air and contemplate the sun." And it was not only the authors of comedy who took a jibe at the new philosophy. The tragedian Euripides also contributed to the general resentment by letting the chorus of an unknown play recite, "Who, seeing this, does not teach beforehand that his soul is considered a god, and does not hurl far from him the crooked deceits of talkers about the heavens, whose mad tongues make random throws about what is hidden, devoid of understanding." Then there's Plato's Apology, where Socrates says that his accusers state, "There is a wise man called Socrates who has theories about the heavens and has investigated everything below the earth and can make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. It is these people, gentlemen of the jury, the disseminators of these rumors, who are my dangerous accusers, because those who hear them suppose that anyone who inquires into such matters must be an atheist." Of course, this testimony from an early dialogue of Plato is most valuable. It probably comes from Plato's Apology. Of course, as it shows that speculating about the heavens was indeed already connected with atheism by Socrates' contemporaries. And then we have a move in a different direction with the sophist Prodicus of Chios from 465 to 395. And Prodicus' theory was parried by Aristophanes' birds of 414 BCE and echoed by Euripides' Bacchae of 406 BCE. Although Prodicus was also one of those philosophers with the reputation of speculating about the heavens, his ideas were much more radical, as according to Philodemus, maintained that the gods of popular belief do not exist, nor do they know, but primitive man, out of admiration, deified the fruits of the earth and virtually everything that contributed to its existence. The highly stylized character of the language suggests that this passage reflects rather closely Prodicus' very words. But what did Prodicus really mean? Renewed attention to the fragmentary papyri that are our best source for Prodicus' ideas has shown that Prodicus proposed a two-stage theory of the origin of polytheism. First, primitive man started to call gods those elements of nature on which he was most dependent, such as sun and moon, rivers, and fruits. There had been a time without gods yet for Prodicus, even though man was already there. Prodicus located the beginning of religion in agriculture. Of course, Euripides, in addition, Prodicus, the only other 5th century intellectuals in whose work clear atheistic statements can be found are Euripides and Critias. And of course, Critias was also a person who was writing, and Plato mentions him in one of his dialogues. Bellerophon, a tragedy that was probably performed around 430 BCE. Bellerophon himself states early in the play, "Does someone say that there are indeed gods in heaven? There are not, if a man is willing not to rely foolishly on the antiquated reasoning. Consider for yourselves, do not base your opinion on words of mine. I might say myself that tyranny kills many men and deprives them of their possessions, and that tyrants break their oaths to ransack cities. And in doing this, they are more prosperous under heaven than men who live quietly in reverence from day to day. I know, too, of small cities doing honor to the gods that are subject to larger, more impious ones, because they are overcome by a more numerous army. I think that if a man were lazy and prayed to the gods, and did not go gathering his livelihood with his hand, you would fortify religion and ill fortune." The statement is a radical expression of a feeling encountered more often in Euripides than that of the irreligious prosper, whereas the pious suffer. Of course, consequently, the gods have no power, and religion is imaginary. Of course, then we have a second passage. It is ascribed to the sophist Critias, but the authorship is highly debated. Critias from around 450 to 403 BCE, who was one of the most unscrupulous members of the 30 Tyrants, a group of aristocrats that had seized power at the end of the Peloponnesian War. Remember, that was written by Thucydides. and of course it was remembered for its rule of terror. Euripides' Sisyphus in 415 BCE, or perhaps more attractively his Autolycos. Yet the recent authoritative edition of Euripides' fragments has not yet been accepted. Has not accepted these arguments and once again ascribes the fragment to Critias. Of course, Philodemus' On Piety from 519 to 541 shows that Epicurus already concluded that what Critias himself had said about the gods made it impossible for them as generally conceived to exist. Critias's reputation as an atheist predates the Hellenistic biographers, the history of atheism. In the history of atheism, for example, there's a long passage about from Critias that says, once there was a time when the life of human beings was disordered and similar to that of animals and ruled by force, when there was no reward for the virtuous nor any punishment for the wicked, and then I think that humans decided to establish laws as punishers so that justice might be ruler and keep crime and violence as slave, and they punished only those who kept doing wrong. Then, since the laws held open deeds of violence in check, they continued to commit them in secret. Then I believe a wise and clever-minded man invented for mortals a fear of the gods, so that there might be a deterrent for the wicked, even if they act or say or think anything in secret. Hence, from this source, he explained the divine. There is a deity who enjoys imperishable life, hearing and seeing with his mind, his thought and attention on all things, bearer of a divine nature. He will hear whatever is said among mortals and be able to see whatever is done. If you silently plot evil, this will not escape the gods, for they have knowledge, which these words he explained in the most delightful part of the teaching and hidden the truth with a false tale. He said that the gods dwell there, where he, by placing them there, could frighten human beings most, whence, as he knew, fears come to mortals and troubles for their wretched life. That is from the vault on high, where they beheld the lightnings and fearful blows of thunder, in heaven with its starry eyes, the beautiful, brilliantly decorated building of time, the wise craftsman. Whence to the brilliant mass of the sun strides, and the liquid rain falls on the earth. It was thus, I think, that someone first persuaded mortals to believe that there exists the race of gods. But in this long passage pronounced by Sisyphus, the cleverest Greek in mythology, we see the first occurrence of the theory that religion, or the gods, was invented to ensure good behavior of humans. It is unique in its time, but it is hardly imaginable that a playwright would put forward such a theory in a play meant to entertain his audience about any previous knowledge of it among its spectators. Of course, parodies of the primeval situation by contemporaries of Euripides, as well, the opposition between public assent to laws but private freedom from restraint, can be paralleled in the work of the contemporary sophist Antiphon, who stated that justice would be most advantageous to a man if he were to regard the laws as great in the presence of witnesses, but nature is great when deprived of witnesses. And Democritus, his institutors of religion, relied on human fear of celestial phenomena, and Prodicus had also advanced a two-stage theory of the development of religion. And so, we have Euripides and Critias, and probably, I would say, as Epicurus, and not sure about Seneca, that's getting on later, but probably I would say other writers like Epictetus, and of course Diagoras was a citizen of the island of Melos, who mocked the mysteries openly after the Athenians had treated his home island badly. Diagoras is already mocked in Hermippus's comedy, Morai, written before 430, in Aristophanes' Clouds. Around 418 BCE, Socrates is called the Melian for espousing atheistic views. Epicurus already mentioned Diagoras together with Critias and Prodicus as the arch-atheists. It is therefore not wholly surprising that in the year 399 BCE, the Athenians charged Socrates as follows: Socrates does wrong by not acknowledging the gods the city acknowledges, and introducing other new powers, or daimonia. He also does wrong by corrupting the young. For many Athenians, Socrates had moved too close to those who questioned the traditional gods. Atheos, godless, without gods, God-forsaken, denoting intellectuals who denied the gods of the city or any form of deity. Louis! The increasing criticism of the gods by philosophers and poets had eroded the traditional beliefs in the gods, and some intellectuals drew the inevitable consequence. Yet the combined power of traditional belief and Plato's influential theism made it that real atheists would always remain a rare phenomenon in the Greek world of classical antiquity and world history, for that matter. Louis? Hi, Louis. Come here. Come here, Louis. The Hellenistic period. The death of Socrates constituted the end of an era. Most philosophers had got the message and remained careful in expounding their views. Theodorus of Cyrene, from around 340 to 250 BCE, is mentioned most with Diagoras as the atheist par excellence. It is hard to reconstruct his theology. Come here, Louis. Come here. Come here, Louis. Epicurus. Come here. Come here. Come here, Louis. From 341 to 270 BCE in the 12th books of his On Nature, which must have been written around 300. So it's written around 300. He probably included his criticisms of Protagoras, Prodicus, Critias, probably Diagoras, as raving lunatics in the context of how men first came to believe in and worship the gods. Hey, Louis. And the end of the 2nd century BCE, the list was extended by the academic skeptic Clitomachus in his treatise concerning atheism. The most important representative of the skeptical academy are Carneades, from 214 to 128 BCE, and he probably had alleged that Epicurus did not really mean what he said about the gods. He in turn was followed by Cicero in his De Natura Deorum, Aetius from around CE 50 to 100, and toward the end of the 2nd century by Sextus Empiricus in his Adversus Mathematicos. And then the poets and his poets and historians as well. In the first quarter of the 3rd century BCE, the Alexandrian Euphemerus wrote the Sacred Record. Euphemerus was particularly successful in Rome, where the poet Ennius, from 239 to 169 BCE, translated his work around 200 BCE into Latin prose, perhaps in preparation of a spiritual climate favorable to the deification of Scipio Africanus, the victor of Carthage and Hannibal in the year 202 at the Battle of Zama. Of course, he was also read by Varro and Cicero. And in the first 2 centuries of our era, atheism had mainly become a label to be used against philosophical opponents, but not to be taken too seriously. Even the Jews knew how to play the game and reproached the Egyptians for their atheism. And so, toward the end of the 2nd century CE, Tatian even mentions that the pagans called the Christians Atheotatus, which is the most atheist ones. And of course, Justinus admitted that the Christians were indeed atheists regarding their attitude toward the pagan gods. And it is indeed hard to see how the pagans could have thought differently, given that the Christians had no temples or statues or deities and did not perform sacrifices. In the eyes of the pagan philosopher Celsus, quoted by Origen in 184 to 254 CE in his Contra Celsum, this made the Christians comparable to other uncivilized peoples who had no gods either, such as the barbaric Scythians or the nomadic Libyans. And of course, Julian the Apostate in his Contra Galileos even stated that the Christians had inherited their atheism from the Jews. And the Christians were not slow in taking up the possibility of labeling opponents atheists and pious heretics. In his Apologeticus of around 200 CE, Tertullian, who existed from 160 to 240, tried to refute the charge by arguing that the pagan gods were no gods at all, but demons. Of course, Origen charged the pagans of an atheist polytheism, or a polytheist atheism. Clement of Alexandria, from 150 to 215, went on further and stated that the real atheists were those who did not believe in God or his providence. Surprisingly, he tried to rehabilitate the canonical atheists such as Diagoras, Euhemerus, Theodorus, by claiming that they had at least recognized the foolishness of the pagan ideas. Of course, the Greeks discovered theoretical atheism, which can be seen to be one of the most important events in the history of religion. And second, the Greeks invented the term atheos, which was taken over by the Romans as atheist, which gave rise to the words atheist and atheism in early modern times. And the Greeks and Romans, pagans and Christians, soon discovered the utility of the term atheist as a means to label opponents. The invention of atheism would open a new road to intellectual freedom.